Welcome to the Book Faire podcast. My name is Anthony, and this week we have an interview with Joanna Ho. New policies proposed in South Carolina would restrict access to books on gender identity and trans topics to minors. An annual right-wing event, See You at the Library, partners with the Department of Education, and a roundup of bills affecting the freedom to read from 2025 Texas Legislative Session. Let's get started with an interview with Joanna Ho, writer of the new children's book, Becoming Boba. Can you start off by introducing yourself to the audience and the book that we'll be discussing today?
Sure, absolutely. My name is Joanna Ho. I am an author of many books for kids. So I write picture books that include Eyes That Kiss in the Corners, We Who Produce Pearls, amongst many others. And I also write young adult novels. So my one novel so far is called The Silence That Binds Us. It was an Asian Pacific American Library Award honor book a couple years ago. And so I am here to talk about Becoming Boba, which is my newest book, just came out yesterday. It is the story of a pearl milk tea. So for those who are not familiar with the drink, it's a drink that originated in Taiwan. The most basic original form was basically like a black or a red tea with milk or condensed milk added, and then large tapioca balls, the pearls. And it has become something of a cultural and a worldwide phenomenon. But, when I was growing up, it was just a drink that I knew in Taiwan. So this book is about a boba, a pearl milk tea named Mindy, who is born with much brighter colors than those of her parents and her ancestors and the other elders in the community, and essentially is on a mission to better understand what it means to be milk tea enough, because she's made to feel like she's not enough because she's different. And on the journey, she learns some of the history of pearl milk tea, which is one that involves colonization, inspiration from other cultures, and ultimately comes to understand that being milk tea enough has nothing to do with milk or tea at all. It is really about evolving as a culture, evolving, and her ability to sort of define what it means to be herself on her own terms.
You said that it's about evolving as a culture. Are there certain aspects of milk tea that have changed as it's kind of exploded into this worldwide phenomenon?
Yeah, what's so interesting about this is the answer is yes. And when I started to write this book, I was on the heels of We Who Produce Pearls, which is a very lyrical kind of look at Asian American history. And it's very, I wouldn't say heavy, but it covers a lot of heavy topics. It was a really it took it out of me emotionally. And when I started to write the boba book, I just was thinking, I want to write a fluffy book with cute boba pictures. It's sort of like, when it first started, at least when I was introduced to it, it was really like pearl milk tea, like black tea, as I had sort of explained before. But even in Taiwan, there are other flavors. It's very typical to have like a taro milk tea or other kinds of tea with milk, but as it has spread, and as it has evolved within Taiwan, more and more creativity, pulling in from other cultures. You've added like other types of toppings, for example, like sago or jellies or aloe or popping boba even. And then, and as it has spread across the world, I think the flavors continue to expand. So in Taiwan, there are lots of fruit tea flavors too, like fresh fruit teas, mango teas, other fruits. And so the flavors themselves have evolved. And I think what's even more interesting is that as it has become this phenomenon, it has actually become so influential that boba culture, boba drinks, is influencing beverages that are completely outside the boba market. So like Starbucks, for example, carries boba drinks now. So it is sort of like the evolution continues to feed other evolutions of other things.
And when we're looking at how milk tea is influencing other things, and just in general, how other cultures influence people worldwide, how important is it to remember those roots, to remember that this is an Asian and Taiwanese drink to start off with? How hard is it to keep those cultural bonds strong?
Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question because I'm a Chinese, Taiwanese American. So of course I feel some personal pride in like, this drink is from Taiwan. And I think it is always important to understand where we're from and the significance. Like the drink itself evolved because of colonization. Like we have boba and pearls because European colonizers took over parts of South America, took over Taiwan, and therefore there was a transference of resources around the globe. Um, and that's an important part of our history to remember, but also pulled inspiration from Southeast Asian cultures. And that's just through inspiration and exposure. And so I do think just for us as humans, like for me, I know the more I do research on my own history, the better I understand who I am. I think where I'm situated, who the shoulders I stand on, but also the shoulders I want to become for people who come after me. And so, in terms of this beverage, I think it's important to remember where it's from and to embrace the way that it has changed.
And you said that a big part of it, the reason that there's the tapioca pearls, the reason why there's all these different flavors is through colonization. Bringing it back to Becoming Boba,
Yeah.
Milk Tea Town wants to keep things traditional in the way they were. Is that history of colonization a reason why they're hesitant to include these flashy, colorful changes to milk tea?
I don't know. I think in reality, I don't know that, like, for example, in Taiwan, people are like, you should only drink the purest form because a lot of that evolution and change and experimentation is happening in Taiwan too. I think that is more a nod to how I felt when I was growing up. Um, and I think you could probably apply it to many contexts. But as an Asian American, I grew up in Minnesota where there weren't a lot of Asians. And I moved to California in middle school where there were a lot of Asians. And I was told in high school by another Asian student that I was a banana, that I was yellow on the outside and white on the inside. And that's because I didn't at the time conform to ways that Asians in the Bay Area were sort of showing their pride at that time. I wasn't doing it the way they felt like I should. And then when I would go to Taiwan and visit family, I was told you're very ABC, American born Chinese, your language, it's your accent, your clothing, your attitude, your dress. Like, it's so obvious you're not from here. And so I was constantly in this space of feeling like I didn't know how to be Asian enough, or I wasn't Asian enough in all these other predefined ways. So I think that that's sort of a nod to just that experience, and then my desire and my own learning personally, and very similar to Mindy's journey in learning the history, finding community, and realizing that this identity of an Asian American is one that I can define for myself.
And for any young readers who may find themselves in a situation, doesn't have to necessarily be Taiwanese or Chinese
Yeah.
American or Asian, who finds themselves struggling with not being enough, what kind of advice would you have for them?
I think it's exactly that. Like, learn about like your own history, about your community's history, find community and understand that nobody gets to define what it means to be any identity, that we all sort of bring our own things to the table. We all have our own experiences and perspectives, and that blend that makes us who we are and allows us to define who we are is sort of what makes us special and unique and powerful, as cliche as that sounds. And then I would say just to remember that they have a voice, that they also get to add that voice into the shaping of this identity, not just for themselves, but to the evolution of whatever community and culture or identity it is that they feel connected to.
You said that you had made a heavy book before this one, We Who Produce Pearls, and you wanted to write something more fluffy. Um, During the writing process, when you started to unpack these aspects of colonialization and a little bit of internalized racism, was there any pushback on your side in the writing process when you wanted to keep things bright and fluffy?
No, I think it's more funny for me because I just seem to be unable to write things that are just fluffy. Even if on a surface level reading it might seem that way. I think my process as a writer, even when I'm telling a totally fictional story, which has been the majority of my books, I always do a lot of research. I interview people, I do a lot of reading. That helps me sort of understand the heart of the story I want to tell. And that kind of is where it comes down to is every story has to have a heart, and my heart always ends up leaning into some kind of truth that is related to speaking truth to power, to sort of pushing back against predefined boundaries. And So for me, it was more like writing right back into a space where I'm comfortable writing, which is in these nuances and layers. And, I would joke with my editor, like, I don't know how to just write fluff. Like, I just wanted to write something really silly with no layered meaning. And it has eluded me so far as an author.
And you said that when you write, you do a lot of research, you talk to a lot of people. That's something that we actually see Mindy doing in Becoming Boba. Would you say that Mindy is kind of a self-insert for you as the writer?
I think it was sort of unintentional but that was her process mirrored my process too. Like, as I learned the history of milk tea, then I also interviewed Andrew Chow, who's the founder of Boba Guys, which is like a nationwide boba chain or boba, company. I learned not just about the history of pearl milk tea, but also about the spread and significance of boba as a cultural phenomenon. And so and it's always been that way. When I was researching Who Produced Pearls, I spent like a year researching, and I find that the more that I learn my own history or the history of whatever I'm, it's kind of back to what I'm saying, I start to understand the heart, I start to understand myself. And so Mindy's journey definitely mirrors one that I've experienced over and over again, in my own personal life, in my own professional life.
So you have Mindy and the young people of Milk Tea Town doing all this research and presenting these ideas that are kind of shaking up the established norms and traditions of Milk Tea Town. Do you want to unpack a little bit about that, about how the young people are the ones who are bringing forth progress and change?
Sure. I mean, I think it's so often how that happens. And it's so interesting to say that as someone who now has kids who probably thinks I'm on the elder side, But I think there's like multiple layers here of recognizing. I think young people have and like they're born with a deep empathy for humanity, like a real sense of justice. And they sort of understand the core of what it means to be just like a compassionate human. And so I think they're often the leading forces of, as they discover themselves, as they continue to define and redefine what's possible, they are able to push for change because they have not yet been limited by so many of the boundaries and limitations that we sometimes start to internalize as adults. And I say that hoping that as an adult that is only getting older, that I can continue to hold on to the ability to see and re-see and re-look at things over and over again, so that I'm always looking with a lens of like what's possible instead of what's always been done. And I recognize at the same time that we stand on shoulders of elders in the story. It's also the elders who, quote, spill some tea, who sort of give them the impetus for this journey of discovery. So it's also on those shoulders that we stand. And those are we become the shoulders as we get older. So it's just layers of, you know, who I hope I can be and who I hope we can all be as we get older, and that we stay young and that we can be strong in every part of the timeline.
And this kind of gets into the last question I like to ask, but I'll save that for a little bit later.
Okay.
Where do you see yourself in this process as a writer for young audiences?
Yeah, my hope is that I can tell stories, I sort of joke about like I can't write fluffy stories even when I'm trying to write one. I think that my heart as an author really is in telling stories that say something about the world. It's sort of my way of having voice to hopefully spark change that is so very needed in many, many ways in the world we're living in right now. And to do it in a way that reaches young people, so that helps them question, it helps them be critical, it helps them empathize and to learn, and to also, most importantly, discover and understand that they have power in the world to create change. So I think that ends up being sort of a theme in many of my books. But it's also been a personal journey of self-discovery. The more that I write, the more connected to my own ancestors that I feel, the more connected to my own community that I feel. And so my hope is, as an author, the stories that I write are not just helping young Asian American kids, but all kids look at each other, look at the world, examine with greater criticality and joy, the world that we live in.
And it does, like I said, it does cover a lot of what I just asked. But the question I like to ask all authors to give you the final word here in the interview is, Joanne, how do you see yourself and the work that you do as a writer?
Okay, so I think it does sort of go to what we were saying, but I think I'm constantly on a space of discovery. Like I'm constantly learning and learning. And I always feel like I'm a baby writer. Like I feel like I have so much to learn. I think my initial stories have been very social justice focused and very lyrical. And that is like a really natural, I think, writing style for me. And I think as a creative, what I'm hoping to do is learn how to tell those same powerful stories with a focus on the story, like on the storytelling and learning how to be more subtle in the I don't want to say message, but like the themes of the stories that are coming through, like what the hearts is. And as a storyteller, I think my hope again is just to tell stories where not just where kids can not just see themselves and see each other, but again to question and to be critical and to feel empowered to lift their voices, to tell their own stories, and to ultimately like work in solidarity to create change.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.
That was an interview with Joanna Ho. Her new book, Becoming Boba, illustrated by Amber Rinn, is available now. You can find more about Joanna and her work at joannahowrites.com. Next, we'll be looking at notable releases out this week, but first, if you appreciate the work being done with the Book Faire podcast, there are a few ways to show your support. First, you can like, comment, favorite, subscribe, or follow the podcast wherever you are currently listening to help push the podcast out to new listeners. Second, you can follow the podcast on Blue Sky at BookFairPod, or you can also go to patreon.com/thebookfair to find episodes posted early, as well as links to news sources used in the show. Lastly, the best way to support the Book Faire podcast is simply to share it with a friend, an educator, or a young reader in your life. Now on with the show. Now let's look at new releases, beginning with Angel Draws a Dinosaur by Pavonis Giron. A budding artist's efforts to draw the best dinosaur ever yield a lesson about embracing imperfection in Giron's upbeat story, which underscores persistence and creativity as antidotes to perfectionism. The protagonist's grand ambitions provide an opening frame, with Angel declaring that he'll create an absolute masterpiece that will hang on museum walls. But after attempts to draw different dinos fail to achieve his mental vision, Angel throws up his hands in frustration. Quick comfort comes from his two moms' snuggles and shared wisdom, and when Mom likens the drawings to fossils, the comment provides Angel the inspiration he needs to assemble a work that satisfies. Bold pinks, purples, and oranges lend gauche and colored pencil scenes an energy that aptly conveys the story's emotional arc, from opening excitement to disappointment to closing pride. This book is recommended for ages 4 to 8. Next up, Arcana No. 1, The Lost Heirs, by Sam Prentice-Jones. UK creator Prentice-Jones centers the spiritual power and mystical origins of tarot in this exhilarating fantasy graphic novel debut and series launch. When James Birdwhistle enters the coffee shop where Eli Jones works, neither young adult knows that the other hides an affinity for magic. Nevertheless, sparks fly. For both James and Eli, this seemingly random encounter turns out to be not only the start of a romance, but the establishment of a supernatural link to the Arcana, a centuries-old organization created as a sanctuary for witches, and later as a protector of the magical world that lives alongside the world of man. As James helps former foster child Eli control his powers, Eli connects with and cultivates a found family of other young Arcana witches. Each protagonist stars in their own chapter, which is denoted by a tarot card related to the character and their personal arc. Stylized artwork is rendered in softly shaded monochromatic hues, punctuated by glowing yellows, symbolizing magic, and ombre fade-outs, signifying flashbacks and preternatural visions. Using a sweet queer romance as an anchor, Prentice-Jones encourages exploration of self, the witch's place within a community, and their personal gifts, magical or otherwise. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. And lastly, Tell Me Every Lie by Ellen Hagen and David Flores. Hagen and debut author Flores team up to present a simmering romance in which two recent high school graduates at an elite resort endeavor to reinvent themselves by telling lies and maybe fall in love. Mia Malik usually plays by the rules. Then her peers take bets on whether she can get a guest at New York's majestic mountain house to fall in love with her in a week. She accepts the challenge, determined to do whatever it takes to win the betting pot and use it to attend a photography program in California. Meanwhile, Queens-raised John Paul, J.P. Reyes, arrives in the company of his wealthy aunt, uncle, and younger cousins. Devastated by his father's sudden death, he resolves to pretend he's both okay and rich during his stay. When Mia and JP meet, sparks fly against the gorgeous Catskill Mountains backdrop. But as they fall for each other, the accumulation of their respective lies and half-truths weigh heavily on their potential happily ever after. The protagonists remain sympathetic, even amid their mutual deceit, while the cozy plot builds to a compassionate, mature, and surprising resolution. This book is recommended for ages 14 and up. And now, finishing the episode with some headlines. I typically try to balance positive and negative news, and this week there wasn't all that much positive news. Just a fair warning. First, the right-wing public demonstration See You at the Library returns for 2025, partnering with the Department of Education. Since 2023, Kirk Cameron, as well as other authors from Brave Books, a group made up of right-wing, self-proclaimed pro-liberty creators, have been leading the See You at the Library event, encouraging people to join in a story hour at public libraries, where there will be book readings. While these books are claimed to be about the freedom of speech, the organization says that they are being silenced, and it's clear that this is a response to alleged indoctrination taking place in libraries and public schools. The Brave Books Frequently Asked Questions page about the event also mentions that there will be readings of books of virtue. However, they encourage primarily books based on Christianity to be brought, as opposed to welcoming other religious views. This year, See You at the Library is partnering with the Department of Education, even though 2 years ago, Brave Books claimed the DOE was funding public school transitioning programs, citing a ridiculous far-right conspiracy theory. Currently, the page for the event shows a partnership with the Department of Education at the Library of Congress. However, no specific times or events or stories are scheduled to take place at the Library of Congress at this moment. See You at the Library is scheduled to take place at over 1,000 libraries across the United States on August 16th. In previous years, there have been people in attendance carrying Confederate flags. Though most locations taking place had fewer than 20 attendees, this is a troubling sign of the politicization of the Department of Education to be affiliating itself with such a far-right and extreme group of authors. Next up, York County Library in South Carolina proposes restrictions on queer books for minors. York County libraries in South Carolina could be facing a change in their policies that will move all content containing trans and gender nonconforming characters, authors, or content out of the teens and children's sections. This change is nearly a one-to-one copy of a policy recently introduced in Greenville, another South Carolina county, in March of this year. The current policy for public libraries in York County contains the typical verbiage consistent with obscenity laws, saying graphic depictions or descriptions of rape or pedophilia, graphic sexual depictions or descriptions, and material that is considered graphic if a person applying contemporary community standards relating to the depiction, etc., prurient interests, etc. It's been covered countless times on this podcast before. However, the proposed updated policy reads, materials targeting audiences aged 0 to 12, which the illustrations, themes, or storylines affirm, portray, or discuss changing the appearance of a minor's gender in ways inconsistent with the minor's biological sex, will be located in the Parent and Early Childhood collection, including social transitioning, pronouns or dress inconsistent with biological sex for the purpose of affirming gender transitioning, medical or surgical procedures, puberty-blocking drugs, cross-sex hormones, or surgical procedures for the purpose of affirming gender transitioning, gender fluidity, the purpose of changing genders at will or being no gender at all for the purpose of affirming gender transitioning. When these policies were adopted in Greenville, South Carolina, Greenville County libraries were sued by 4 parents and supported by the South Carolina chapter of the American Civil Liberties Union and the federal ACLU. While there are valid reasons to remove material from children's and teens sections, doing so for any mention of gender affirmation and social transitioning is a form of discrimination. Pickens County Library, also in South Carolina, proposed a similar policy and were warned they could face a similar lawsuit from the ACLU. Pickens reversed their decision shortly after. Hopefully, the ACLU continues their work protecting the freedom to read, and we see the York County Library Board similarly back down from these discriminatory policies. And lastly, let's go over a roundup from the 2025 Texas legislative session. This summary comes directly from the Texas Freedom to Read Project. You can find the full wrap-up as well as support the organization at txftrp.org. Senate Bill 412, criminalizing librarians, educators, psychiatrists, psychologists, and mental health providers. This bill passed and was signed on May 19, 2025. Effective September 1, 2025, Texas Penal Code will remove defenses to prosecution for certain offenses involving material or conduct that is obscene or otherwise harmful to children for bona fide educational, medical, psychological, psychiatric, judicial, law enforcement, or legislative policies. Senate Bill 12, relating to parental rights in public education, to certain public school requirements and prohibitions regarding instruction, diversity, equity, and inclusion duties, and social transitioning, and to student clubs at public schools. This bill has been passed and is awaiting governor's signature. The provision against instruction, guidance, activities, or programming on gender identity or sexual orientation will likely be used to remove library books, especially since they took out the provisions that exempted the display or provision of literature or other material that is unrelated to the course or subject being taught. Senate Bill 13, creating school library advisory councils that can determine which books students can access in school libraries. This bill passed and is currently awaiting the governor's signature. This law will allow for the creation of a politically appointed school library advisory council for school districts if the parents of at least 10% of the students enrolled in the district or 50 or more parents of students enrolled in the district, whichever is fewer, present to the board a petition to establish a local school library advisory council. These councils are tasked with advising which books should be included in school libraries at the district level. Now let's look at some good news. House Bill 3225, which would have restricted minors' access to certain materials in public libraries, has failed to pass this session. This bill would have violated the First Amendment rights of children and teens to access books in the general collections of municipal public libraries across the state. In an attempt to protect children from sexually explicit materials, the bill would have actually caused harm to teens seeking health information, classic works of literature, and artwork by preventing them from accessing books vaguely defined as sexually explicit. The failure of this bill was a concentrated effort based on strategic conversations aimed at protecting parental rights and empowering local government control. The Texas Freedom to Read Project could not have prevented this bill from passing without support from their coalition of library advocates, parents, and students in the state of Texas. House Bill 1375 relating to civil liability for obscenity. This bill failed to pass this session. Under this bill, news broadcasters, other information providers, and commercial entities would face civil penalties for providing vaguely defined, harmful material to minors. While not explicitly mentioned in the text, the bill would have financially harmed booksellers for providing certain books to minors. After pushback from small businesses, including local bookstores, this bill failed to pass. And House Bill 183, relating to the regulation and the review of certain library materials included in public school libraries. This bill failed to pass. Despite another attempt by Representative Patterson to attack local school libraries, this bill did not get heard. This bill was not heard by the state House of... This bill was not heard by the Texas House Public Education Committee. Reminiscent of Utah's HB 29, this bill would have allowed the State Board of Education to develop a statewide list of prohibited library materials, taking away local control from parents and school boards. That wraps up the list of bills targeting libraries that passed and some that did not pass in the state of Texas during this legislative session. Thank you to the Texas Freedom to Read Project for this list, and for any other resources, you can check their website, txftrp.org. And this will conclude another episode of the Book Faire podcast. School is out for the summer for most people, so it is a good time to check your local public libraries for any summer reading programs or just to find a good book to keep yourself busy. You can find more information about news stories at patreon.com/thebookfair. Following is free. There are no payments required to access sources. Thank you so very much for listening, and as always, I'll talk at you next time.